Good morning, everyone. My name is Gwen Bear. I am the elder in residence at University of New Brunswick. I've been there almost 2 years now. I might get the hang of it by the time there's no more funding for it. You know how these things go, right? We are in Wolastoq territory. We call it Wolastoq, and we call ourselves Wolastoqiyik. This is also known as Maliseets and Maliseet territory. But I had I don't know what they're called, an idea, big thinking idea. One day when I was going out for a walk and heading towards the river about how the word Maliseet separates us from that river, you know, because you call it St. John River, and here we have just two separate words, and there is no connection. But when I say Wolastoq, which is the river, and Wolastoqiyik, which is the people, there is a connection. And that's what we want to teach our children. You know, they need to know that they're connected to something, that they're connected to, well, that beautiful river. I mean, it's not that beautiful anymore, but there's things upriver that contribute to it, which take away from the beauty. But it's still here, and we're still here, and I think that's the important thing. This morning, we're welcoming, are you a doctor? James Bartleman? You're not a doctor? We had Dr. Lawyer Injun Chief the other morning, so that was pretty good. And traditionally, you do that with a song. For us, the chants are prayers, and they are welcomes, and the chants serve as a, you know how the vibrations of the music go out, right? And they go out in all directions. So when I go like this, that's the attention getter. Not just of you, but the spirits as well, the grandfathers and the grandmothers, and the little people. So all of those are welcoming all of you, and especially you, because this is the way that we start. And I didn't have a song in mind this morning, but I think I'd like to sing the song to the Wolastoq this morning. Since I talk so long, I have to sing a shorter song. Wolastoq ba malagwe aji deba miko Wolastoq malagwe zupegwel mia niguaspa mipin wazizajnilaska miel niguaspa mipin wazizajnilaska miel Wolastoq ba malagwe aji deba migo Wolastoq malagwe zupegwel mia niguaspa mipin wazizajnilaska miel niguaspa mipin wazizajnilaska miel Wolastoq is flowing child I will always be. Mother, carry me. A child I will always be. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Gwen, for your welcome and your blessing. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brunswick. On behalf of the University of New Brunswick and St. Thomas University, we're delighted to be able to welcome you here this morning to the 9th in our Big Thinking lecture. We hope very much that you're enjoying your time with us, and I have to say we're very pleased with the way our two universities have come together. We have an extremely good team, core team of organizers and an army of volunteers, some 400 strong, who are helping to bring this event to you. If you've been able to attend the other lectures in this series, I hope you are like me. I feel somewhat dazed and confused by all the big thoughts coming my way, and I'm wandering around just pondering all the wonderful ideas, some of the harrowing tales that we've heard of the residential school system through this week. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you this morning Mr. James Bartleman. Not only was he Ontario's first Aboriginal Lieutenant Governor, but he's also had a very long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service. He has served as the Canadian Ambassador to Cuba, to Israel, the North Atlantic Council of NATO, to the European Union, and as High Commissioner to South Africa and later to Australia. He's also served as the Director of Security and Intelligence for the Department of External Affairs and as Foreign Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister. While he has dedicated 35 years of his career to diplomatic service, I think the issue that's closest to his heart is the future of our young Aboriginal Canadians. As a member of the Chippewas of Rama First Nation, Mr. Bartleman has worked tirelessly to raise awareness about mental illness, literacy, and education on reserves. When he was Lieutenant Governor, he founded the Lieutenant Governor's Book Program and sent over 1 million used books to First Nation schools in the province of Ontario. He is the author of 4 best-selling autobiographical books and recently published his first novel, As Long as the River Flows. It deals with the residential schools and the causes and effects of abuse across generations. During his Big Thinking lecture today, Mr. Bartleman will talk about the impact of the residential school experience on Aboriginal youth, and he'll discuss how the suicide epidemic in Aboriginal communities might be overcome and how we can empower young people to succeed. Please join me in welcoming Mr. James Bartleman.
Thank you, President Campbell. And it's so nice to be here. Nice to see friends from the Trudeau Foundation and people I've met or people we've had, or at least people who share common friends with me. And I'd like to, I welcome the opportunity to speak about something which is very close to my heart. In 1952, Ralph Ellison, the great American black writer, published The Invisible Man. In his book, the protagonist lives in plain sight, both in the American South and in New York, but is invisible to mainstream society because he is a black American. And this book, his book, together with those of other great black writers of that period, like James Baldwin and Richard Wright, helped inspire and provided sort of an intellectual and emotional sustenance to the coming civil rights campaigns and revolution of the early 60s in the United States. They had their impact because they influenced both black and white societies. Today, black Americans are no longer invisible. In Canada, however, generations of Native children have been invisible. For over 100 years, the children who attended residential school were invisible to mainstream society as a whole. And that is why the abuses which carried on for all those years were permitted to go on. Permitted to go on by a society which prided itself as being one of the most just in the world, which helped, under John Humphrey's draft, the United Nations Convention on Human Rights, and who has never shied away from telling other countries how they can behave better internationally. Meanwhile, there was this invisible Native population, 150,000 in residential schools. But what, and maybe this is one of the angles of, or aspects of the big idea, the generation that emerged after the closing of the schools 30 years ago has likewise been invisible in Canadian society. Like Ellison's Invisible Man, they are invisible in plain sight of mainstream society. And I say they're invisible because there can be no other explanation for Canadian society as a whole ignoring the constant media coverage of their living conditions. I mean, every week there's a major story in the CBC or elsewhere on the terrible conditions in the northern Ontario and elsewhere, but it is like water off the back of a duck. They ignore the reports of the polluted water, the overcrowding. And this is something which I can't really understand, I'm very sad about. And they ignore the constant representations made by the chiefs about the unequal education funding. I mean, what is not sunk into the Canadian public, or they just don't care, but maybe it's just because Native children are invisible. If you are a Native child on a reserve in Canada, you get about 80% of what a non-Native child receives in terms of your educational funding. Just like the conditions that Ellison and others were talking about in the 50s, where in the United States you had, in the South, separate but so-called equal schools. They were separate, but they certainly weren't equal in terms of funding. And we have exactly the same thing here in Canada. And nobody seems to pay any attention to it. Sean Atleo mentioned that, but I'm sure just the public, the media, you know, when they report that news, they say, well, so what? I was in Toronto giving a speech, and I ran into a very senior member of the CBC about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And we were waiting for Porter Airlines to take us back to Ottawa. And I talked about this, you know, he said, do you realize that Native children only get 80% of what white kids get? And yet they live in appalling circumstances. They don't have special education. They have no money for books, or and they have to pay for teachers who come in, have culture shock, and leave, and then fly back. And he said, so what? He said, they're third world, and they're better off than most third world kids. And I couldn't understand this person who, you know, with his heart is bleeding over the situation in the Sudan and in Afghanistan, but he would accept this circumstance. The only conclusion I drew was it could be inherent racism, it could be, let's say, information overload, but more likely just These were invisible people. Why else would 32 or 33 reports from the Auditor General passionately explain that the conditions for people, especially the children, and a young population, one that has exploded, with their hundreds of thousands of Native children there, be completely ignored because the children are invisible? And why else would people pay no attention to the fact that it will take the information that's been out there, people paying no attention to, that it will take at least 28 years for the kids on reserve to attain the same high school graduation rates as non-Native kids, and the gap is growing. It is not regarded as a crisis at all in the country. And the consequences have been that enormous. You know, their youth gangs are emerging in communities. In Northern Ontario, which I know so well, in which I traveled to, dozens and dozens and dozens of times because I had access to Ontario government aircraft, the children, the young teenagers being sent out to Rocky Mountain House prison in Winnipeg are coming back as recruiters for the Native Posse and other gangs. That did not exist when I was going up there, when I was up there about 2 years ago, but the Grand Chief told me that is the case. And they are finding in the gangs the love and support that they don't get from their own families. But it's a violent love and support. They're the in-group who, to recruit people, the recruit has to kill an animal or a person. And they're introducing drugs through Percocets and oxycodone into some of the communities. The prisons across the country are filling with these children who are invisible in society and who don't feel wanted by their families, by society, by governments. And most terrible of all, they're just opting out and killing themselves. One extreme, they turn to violence and gangs, and the other extreme, they just kill themselves. And this, in Northern Ontario and in Nunavut, the two areas that I know about from travel, it is particularly bad. And I think that to a great extent, when they die, it's because they are seeking the attention in their deaths by killing themselves that they don't get when they're alive. Because when a Native kid dies, the whole community more or less shuts down. There is poems written about them, which are circulated about their wonderful lives being lost and all the rest. There is a community-wide funeral where everyone, it's not the stoic Native person. These are people in tears, the entire community crying because they're the loss of this young person. And they say, well, they'd like to get a bit of that for themselves because they're not getting it when they're alive. And at the other extreme, it's a way of taking revenge against their parents for not being good parents, against the community for not being paying any attention to them, to society as a whole, for keeping them invisible. You've heard from Chief Littlechild a lot about residential schools this week already. Maybe I could just add a little bit of more context. For the first 200 years in Canada, Native and non-Native people lived, in my version of history, in a symbiotic relationship. When the French came, they needed Native people because they had souls that could be saved from the devil. They also had furs, which they could use to make money. And then later on, they were warriors that were essential in fighting the English until 1763. Then after that, the British picked up the torch, and they needed the native people for furs, but mainly in that era as warriors fighting the Americans, because the whole western part of the United States and the northwest of what became, well, Ontario, was sort of a no man's land. And the British gave presents to the natives to keep them on side and to raid the Americans. And then and it paid off in the War of 1812, because if it hadn't been for the arrival of Tecumseh with the Shawnees from the Ohio Valley and the pouring down from the area I come from and the Muskoka and Georgian Bay area of so many Anishinaabe warriors, and if it hadn't been for the Six Nations people from around Brantford who played a particular role in the Battle of Queenston Heights, the capture of Detroit as well by native people scaring the daylights out of the Americans, Canada would have been lost, at least Upper Canada would have been lost to the Americans. But as soon as that war was over, the natives were of absolutely no value, and they were shoved off into reserves, and then the emergence of this horrible social engineering experiment, which lasted over 100 years of residential schools, whereas Chief Littlechild would have told you 150,000 children, generation after generation, were sent to residential schools, raised as orphans or as prisoners, came home not knowing how to raise families, never having heard anyone say they loved them, and therefore they never said they loved them to their kids. And then their children would go off as somewhat dysfunctional and return even more dysfunctional, generation after generation after generation, up until the 1980s. And the intellectual brainchild behind that, the person who gave the intellectual and poetic inspiration for that, in the same way that Ellison and Baldwin and others gave their inspiration for something positive, was Duncan Campbell Scott, one of the great poets of the Confederation, who was 52 years in the Department of Indian Affairs, and who brought about, under his watch, the regulations would put Native people in jail if they practiced their potlatch ceremonies, and who gave authorization by law to the police to seize the children and take them by force to put them in schools. And I just want to read a little excerpt of one of his poems, because in his era, he was someone that was respected for his views on Native people. This is called the Onondaga Madonna. She stands full-throated and with careless pose, this woman of a weird and waning race, the tragic savage lurking in her face, where all her pagan passion burns and glows. Her blood is mingled with her ancient foes and thrills with war and wildness in her veins. Her rebel lips are dabbled with the stains of feuds and forays and her father's woes. And closer in her shawl about her breast, paler than she her baby clings and lies, the latest promise of her nation's doom, the primal warrior gleaming from his eyes. He sulks and burdened with his infant gloom. He draws his heavy brows and will not rest. The influence on society of his poetry and so many other well-intentioned people who brought so much evil on Canadian society is reflected in that. I made a trip when I was lieutenant governor. I get 3 more minutes. The drummer took 3 minutes. I made it, when I became lieutenant governor, I wanted to see this part of Ontario. I had never traveled to Northern Ontario in that far area, this big terra incognita with all these reserves up there, and I wanted to go up. So I went up to Saskatchewan in 2002, just after I became lieutenant governor. And as my plane was coming into to land, there was another plane waiting to take off, and a great crowd of people. I thought they were there for me, but nobody was there for me. They were there to say farewell to a 13-year-old girl who had killed herself. She wanted to die, and she had melted down Tylenol 3, filled up a syringe, and injected herself until she died. And I asked the chief why she did it, and he said, it's because she had no hope. Not too long afterwards, the Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation, which comprises 49 communities, called me to say that 3 kids had killed themselves in Wanneman Lake First Nation. Could I come up? It was just, he wanted to show the kids in the community that the people on the outside cared, and nobody was ever going into the communities. So I went up to Wanneman Lake, and when I spoke to the children in the combined grade 7 and 8 class, 3 of them had died, had killed themselves. The others looked like they were in a state of terminal depression. Their eyes were cast down. They had hoods over their heads. Their parents, when I spoke to them, said they died because they had no hope. And one of them, a 12-year-old girl, had hanged herself in a tree outside the school as her classmates came to, or a 13-year-old came to school in the morning. Then, not too long afterwards, I went to Mishkakogomang. It used to be called Osingburg House First Nation. And as I drove into the community, or as I was driven into the community by the Ontario Provincial Police, what struck me was the number of cemeteries. They were full of crosses and fishing line and baseball caps, and I asked what was going on, and I discovered that they had over the past 10 years literally hundreds of deaths by all sorts of violent means, murders, manslaughters, people getting drunk and falling through the ice, and people being run over on the railway tracks, but most of all, the kids killing themselves. And the same answer, they were killing themselves because they had no hope. This deeply affected me, as it would anybody. I had my own battles with depression and suicide. When I was High Commissioner in South Africa, I had been beaten up and humiliated and gagged, and I was dying of asphyxiation, and I managed to live, but then I went into a big spiral, and it took me about a year to rid myself of a tremendous desire to die. And so I'd come out of that, but I was very sensitive to that issue. And also my mother, when we were kids, her mother had not gone to a residential school, but she had spent most of her childhood in a sanatorium because Native people had TB. And so she had no idea how to raise a child when she got out. And she beat my mother and took 2x4s to the children. And she married when she was 14, she married my father, who was a young white man in the nearby community. And we came along in short order, and she was a wonderful mother, and she remains a wonderful mother at the age of 88. But she would get so depressed that she would take her pipe, because Native ladies smoked pipes in those days, and she would go out the back door into the bush and tell us that she was going off to kill herself. And you can imagine the impact that had on the 4 kids. But she always come back. She loved us, and that kept her together. And so I was deeply affected by these suicides that I heard about. Then I discovered that there had been an epidemic of children's suicide from 1987, shortly after, about 10 years after the closure of the last residential school, and just several years after the opening of the area through winter roads, where the kids and people were able to go out and then discover that they were unwanted by the society of Northern Ontario. And that's when the suicides began. And there's been about 300 suicides in this area since that time of children, probably another 300 that are classified, and these are hanging and shootings, mainly hangings, boys and girls equally, and at least another 300 that are marked down as accidents. And I thought of my own background, how lucky I was. When I grew up in Ontario, the Ontario of the 1940s and 50s, Native people didn't have the vote. We lived in a white village because once my mother married a white man, she was banished from the reserve. But we weren't accepted in the white community either because my mother was Native and we were dirty half-breeds, as they called us at school. We had a wonderful time, eventually. We lived up near the dump on a tent beginning, and we had access to the best stuff that the rich tourists threw out. And we never had any competition because the white kids wouldn't go foraging through the dump. But that's how I learned to read the comic books up at that dump. But the hard part was the racism by good people in the community, because you couldn't be invisible in a little village. And so that's when I developed a great passion for reading, and I was able to dream of a life other than living as a day laborer. I was able also to take advantage of opportunities that came along, and this is something I advise everybody to do. When I was in high school, I worked on the estate of a rich American, the chairman of the board of Pittsburgh Paint and Plate Glass. And he sent me off to finish high school, courtesy of Pittsburgh Paint and Plate Glass, and then to university. And so that's the secret to success. Find a rich American, have him send you off, and then I joined the Foreign Service. But I never forgot those early years. Excuse me. And what I saw when I went up there in general was an entire generation of kids who are in tremendous emotional distress. One of the things I asked the Premier when I left my job as Lieutenant Governor was to establish a legacy gift, because they give legacy gifts to retiring Lieutenant Governors, of literary prizes for Aboriginal children. And so he agreed. And every year we hand out 6 $2,500 prizes for the best poem or short story for any Aboriginal children across Ontario. First Nation, Métis, Inuit. They're all free to apply. And we take them to the great powwow in Toronto or Hamilton with a chaperone. And what was very sad, in a way, was that we get about 500 applicants per year, 500 submissions. 90% of them are about marginalization, about rejection, about families, about father and mother fighting physically in their houses. They have, a girl is walking through the reserve in her poem, and she talks about there's nothing to eat at home. And she looks in the window of another house, and there's people sitting down eating. They look happy. There's nothing for her, and she's so sad. There have been other story about, husband and wife fighting, constantly fighting. She doesn't know what to do. And this is over 400 stories. Every year it comes out. And not just in the north, but from Aboriginal children in the cities as well, which surprised me. And so that, for me, is an indication that there is a big crisis among the Aboriginal youth. And so I decided that I would do what I could to help. And I established, by involving civil society, I put 1.5 million books into the communities. I established summer reading camps. I twinned schools. I established a book club. I led a big media campaign, taking the national, the global news, CBC, whatever, Sun newspaper, National Post. They all did stories, but made no impact. I'm no longer Lieutenant Governor, and my view is that individuals cannot do or cannot take on the responsibility of governments. They can show a marginalized group that they care, but it's the governments that have to provide the funding to provide schooling and child welfare services. So I thought, I certainly am no Ralph Ellison, but we need Native writers who can describe the Native experience, just like the black writers in the United States did when they were faced with their crisis. And so I wrote a novel, and I'll read a few excerpts from it. And just when matters seemed to be going their way, the young people began to kill themselves. This is 1987. Children as young as 12 were doing it. Girls as well as boys were involved. They joined together in suicide pacts. They copied the action of friends who had killed themselves, and they deliberately overdosed on drugs before doing themselves in. More often than not, they hanged themselves, making a statement in the extreme manner of their deaths that they considered themselves to be fundamentally worthless and to merit suffering as they left this world. In their farewell messages, many said they had no other way to escape pain, and almost all of them said life was not worth living. Across the vast northern wilderness, families were shattered emotionally and communities were left deeply scarred and in a state of shock. Schools and band offices closed, and there were wakes and funeral services. People, many of them strangers, alerted to the tragedy by the native language radio station, came from reserves across northern Ontario to demonstrate solidarity with the bereaved in the face of the incomprehensible suicide of one of their own. If the death was in the winter, the people would mount their old broken-down vehicles and travel great distances by winter road to the home of the grieving family. In summer, a few would come by boat, but most arrived by air, somehow finding the money for the fare. They would be met either at the shore or at the airport by volunteers in pickup trucks who would drive them to the home of the deceased. There they would take their place outside in the lineup of friends and neighbors and other visitors from far away and wait patiently to go in to express their condolences. When their turn came, they would mount the steps of the stoop, push the door open, enter the house, grasp the hands of the family members waiting solemnly inside, averting their eyes in accordance with their custom, and express their sorrow over and over again in the soft, measured tones of their language. After handing over simple gifts of food, a loaf of bread, a bag of flour or sugar, a fish, a smoked goose, a piece of venison or moose meat, they would stand silently and respectfully in front of the simple wooden coffin holding the body of the young person in the living room. And later that evening, they would return to sit throughout the night, weeping and keening and singing the heartfelt, comforting old hymns with the families of the bereaved. After the formal church service, usually held in the school auditorium or hockey arena to accommodate the press of numbers, the people would go home and life on the reserve would slowly return to normal. Another teenager would then be found dead, lying in the underbrush by the side of the road from a drug overdose. dangling from a cord attached to a hook in a closet, or hanging from a rope or tied to a tree outside a school as other children proceeded to class in the morning. The cycle of grief, mourning, and incomprehension would begin again. Why? Parents, chiefs, religious leaders, teachers, and the staff at the nursing stations all wanted to know why. In my book, I talk about the daughter of the protagonist, Martha, being affected by her mother's ignoring her and beating her and seeking companionship. Her name was Raven. Raven roamed the community with kids seeking a companionship and love wherever they could find it. They gathered at night behind the impersonal, windowless walls of the co-op to express their self-hatred and disgust at life and their revolt against their parents by smoking and drinking and littering the ground with empty cigarette packages and booze bottles, by cutting themselves with razor blades, by melting down over-the-counter drugs and injecting them into their veins, by swallowing oxycodone and Percocet pills stolen from their parents who had smuggled them into the community to feed their own addictions, by inserting their heads into black garbage bags to sniff the fumes of gasoline and hairspray, and by squirting insect repellent straight into their nostrils to get a quick high. When they emerged from the shadows, they scrawled, "Hypocrites, go home," on the walls of their overcrowded, polluted, and rotting school, giving the finger to the white teachers who arrived each fall, promising to be their friends, but who often betrayed them by leaving at Christmas and not coming back when their holidays are over. Out at the airport, they did the same thing, writing, "Welcome to hell," on the side of the terminal building to show their disdain for the so-called experts from the outside who flew in regularly to tinker ineffectually with the defective community water, sanitation, and electrical systems. Now, I attended 3 anti-suicide conferences organized by Native people for Native people in Northern Ontario with healing circles. And this be a bit emotional, I warn you, are stories of true stories that I pulled together, combining them, of children or parents of children who died. The mother of Rebecca, the first of the 3 children to die, embraced the talking stick and said nothing as tears rolled down her cheeks. She twisted her hands and shifted her weight from one side of her seat to the other, and she did not break her silence. Finally, in a small, lisping voice, she started to speak, holding her hand in front of her mouth. "I feel so bad. She was so young, our only child. Who would have thought it? I've not spoken of my pain before. It was too hard." The mother sobbed openly, abject and animal-like in her misery, and leaned her head on her husband's shoulder. He, too, began to cry and held her tightly. "I was the one who found her," she said, straightening up and no longer attempting to hide the gap in her teeth, in her mouth. "I'd been drinking, and me and my husband were fighting. Don't even know what it was about. He'd slugged me in the mouth, knocking out most of my front teeth and opening my lip. And he hit me again, giving me a black eye. I went out and got a piece of firewood and gave him a taste of his own medicine. I guess we were both pretty drunk. Rebecca came in yelling for us to stop. She was crying like crazy and saying she couldn't live no more like that. She decided to kill herself, she said. It was a cry for help, but I didn't believe her. She'd said the same thing before, had never done nothing. She'd always been a handful, and I thought she was just acting up. I laughed at her and told her she had it easy compared to the old days when we lived on the land and when it was a life and death struggle to survive. I told her the government gave us everything. The government would give her everything. So it was the problem. I turned her away. She was hanging from a wire in the clothes closet. I blamed myself and feel bad. I should have listened to her and told her I loved her. A long silence followed, disturbed only by quiet weeping from someone in the audience, and the woman began again. When I look back, I realized I was always too impatient. She could never satisfy me. I wasn't there to fix dinner for her. I never encouraged her to do good at school. I was always shouting at her, just like the nuns used to do to me at residential school. Her husband held his head in his hands, and loud, convulsive sobs racked his body. It gets worse, the woman said, reaching over and trying to wipe away the tears of her husband with her hand. When she was just a little girl, she told me her grandfather was touching her in her private parts and doing things to her. I freaked out because that's what the priest used to do to me, only worse. But to my shame, I blamed her for tempting her grandfather. I slapped her just as I had been slapped by the nuns when I asked them to tell the priest to leave me alone. She must have felt bad, just like I felt when that happened to me. I know it went on for years, and I never did nothing to stop it. I'm so ashamed. The last excerpt is also a combination of several mothers and fathers who talked at the healing circles. When Sarah's mother took hold of the talking stick, a talking stick in Aboriginal culture, once you have the stick, you have the floor. No one can interrupt you. When Sarah's mother took hold of the talking stick, the words burst from her mouth like air from an overinflated balloon pricked by a knife. I know why she did it. She went out to Thunder Bay and spent the winter with my sister. She went to school and did good. She went to powwows and to events at the Friendship Center. She loved the big drum and native culture and became a jingle dancer. At my sister's church, they respected native spirituality. They said there was one creator for everyone. When she came back, the other kids said she was putting on airs about her good grades and made her feel ashamed of them. The neighbors told her not to practice jingle dancing in front of the house, and I didn't stick up for her. They said it was superstition and a dance of the devil. When she played powwow music in the house, the other kids said their parents told them not to listen to it. It was pagan. She felt bad because they took away her pride in being native, and she decided to die. She told me she was going to kill herself, and I went to the nursing station for help. I know the staff there because I got diabetes real bad, and they were always helpful. But they said they had no resources to deal with suicidal people. They telephoned the doctor at the hospital in Thunder Bay. He asked them if they thought she was really serious, and they said they didn't know. Kids were always threatening to kill themselves, they said. Not too many followed through. He prescribed some pills and said he'd interview her the next time she came to the reserve. I saw her take a rope that day, but I didn't do nothing. I've never been any good at taking decisions, especially since I came down with diabetes. I was looking out the kitchen window and saw her climbing a tree. She tied one end of a rope to a branch and the other around her neck. She looked at me and I looked at her. I should have run out and told her to come down, but I froze. I couldn't even cry out. She hung onto the tree for a minute looking at me, and I tried to call the nursing station to ask them what to do, and she jumped before they came on the line. I'll never forgive myself. You know, I never even told her I loved her. She was only 13. So these are true stories. I think in terms of where we go from here, maybe we could put that in the dialogue that we're going to have. Merci beaucoup. Miigwech. Go over here.
So, good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Lise Bissonnette, and I'm here as a PhD student in literature, and they took advantage of my presence to ask me to go back to my time as a journalist. But I must say I was mostly a political journalist, and so it's kind of strange for me to discuss these kind of issues, because when we were journalists in Ottawa, I used to be a correspondent for the Devoir in Ottawa and then editorial writer. We didn't discuss these issues the way you did this morning. So I'll come back to my the first comment that you said this morning about the journalist who told you this is third world. I was struck at the very beginning of your speech by that, and so my first question is going to be somewhat political. You've lived all your adult life, if I can say, inside the federal government. Though you were in the foreign service and very often away, you were inside this space of the federal government. You were part of the institutions, and third world conditions that are still in existence today
is something that the government will have to deal with. You said at the end of your speech that you believe in the power of literature, and if someone, I'm the one to agree with you on that, but nevertheless, you said governments can do things that individuals cannot. So how do you explain today the failure of institutional reform? I know it's a vast question, but nevertheless, I mean, it's been going on for years and years and years. There is a failure of institutional reform in Canada. How do you explain it, that we've never learned to deal with the basic questions there?
Well, the other speakers, the national chief and the commissioner, gave views in which they said the glass was half full. Mm-hmm. I think the glass is half empty. Mm-hmm. But their job is to jolly people along to some extent, and to get cooperation and to make and to find some way of getting the resources by being nice to the government. Well, I don't think the government's going to be very nice unless there is a change in the attitude of the population as a whole. And there has to be, the Native people as a whole have been invisible, visibly, and especially the Native children. And there is sort of an innate, not innate, but there is prejudice against Native people. In the Ipsos Reid polls, they consistently show, in terms of the hate list, the ones at the top of the list most discriminated against are Aboriginal Canadians, followed by Muslim Arabs, followed by Black Canadians. And the Native Canadians consistently throughout the years end up as the top of the hate list in that sense. So, and also I think people have heard about Native issues for so long, their eyes just glaze over, and they are invisible. They think the challenge is to make them visible. I think that at the basic level, there should be a consensus in society that Native children should receive a Native child should receive the same amount of money for his or her education at the elementary and secondary level as a non-Native child. If this was in the United States, there would be a great uproar. This was one of the reasons for the civil rights movement in the United States. But nobody is in the streets here. It's because it's been there invisible all these years, and people just take it for granted. Even the chief, he makes speeches, the national chief, about the issue. No one pays the slightest bit of attention. There is no groundswell of support for Native children. Mm-hmm. Native children, the expenditures per child for Native children in child welfare, in the child welfare world, are much lower. If you're a white or non-Native child, much more, maybe double, the expenditures are provided for you. But if you're a Native child, you're often just forgotten in the mix. But I think we should establish a level playing field. I'm in my new world of trying to be a writer. I leave it to the chiefs and the others to go and to make representations. But I think everybody should be ashamed of the fact that the most vulnerable group in the country, in the midst of all this agony that I tried to describe in terms of suicides that's been going on for years, and it's far worse in Nunavut than it is in Northern Ontario, that we will not even provide those kids with the same amount of money for their education as white kids. And when a school burns down, there's no firefighting equipment, so when it starts fire, they normally go right to the ground. the school may not be built for 10 or 20 years. It's just put on a list. And so it is a terrible situation.
And that's basic justice that you're
Yeah.
talking about.
Elementary
Yes,
basic justice.
Basic justice. Once, if ever we get there, I mean, it will not heal everything that you've been talking about. I mean, education is the basis. But we don't have much time to talk about it, but I would like to hear you more about you've turned to the healing power of literature, of books, while you were lieutenant governor, you explained. And now you, after writing essays and autobiography, you're turning to literature and fiction. So why is it? Is it because you feel that you're getting nearer to the issue that you've been talking about this morning, which is...
I want to answer Duncan Campbell Scott.
Oh, yes, all right. I do understand. This was terrible.
And lots of poems like that. I think
and
I'm
lots
great...
of novel writers. I think of Thériault in Quebec and all of this, which it was prejudice, but in a way it was sort of literary prejudice, and it was a sort of an admiring sort of hate. It's just kind of strange. So you want to...
I am a great believer in the power of the written word, and I think it's going to be a long-term process. The governments have a responsibility to provide the same basic services to everybody in the country. Families, Native families, have a responsibility to be better parents. That was the theme of all the suicide conferences I went to with Native people. Tell your kids you love them. Take them out on the land. Feed them proper meals. Be better parents. And there is a role for civil society in all of this. I started all these various things. I raised about $8 million and for summer camps and reading clubs and all the rest of it. But why can't a civil society show the Native kids that they care? I think, and I have the impression that civil society, the type of people who are in this room tonight, or today, this morning, are very concerned about these issues.
Yes.
And what could you do? Why, for example, we have about 55 universities in Canada.
95.
How many?
95.
That's with colleges. Universities are in the 50s, and then the colleges on top of that. I got 9 universities and 4 colleges in Ontario, each to provide camps to individual communities. If we had all 95 across the country adopt one reserve, one First Nation, to put in, to run a camp, $32,902, that's the way the budget I worked out. You send university students up there who become role models for the kids. And to mentor communities, to help them as they, because they lack administrative capability. That would be 95 right there that civil society could do. There are things like that that can be done. Another idea that I think would be great would be to have for civil society would be to establish a youth corps of somewhat similar. The 40 camps that I've been paying for up until next summer, after with the money I raised, we send up about 90 university students to Northern Ontario every summer. They get 2 weeks, they get a week training at Lakehead University. Then they go in for about 10 weeks into the remote reserves. About 5 of them go into each reserve. The communities know what's going on. They provide 5 to 10 of their young people to work with the university students. And the kids just gravitate to the students that go up there. They're role models for them. They'd never see anybody from the outside, and they hug them, and they help them, and they play games. I went to Extrata and got money for an art program and the Ontario College of Art and Design is putting it into the program there. Why couldn't the universities and colleges across Canada decide that they're going to adopt communities and work on a youth corps in the summer months? It doesn't cost all that much money. And do things like that to complement, to show the Native communities that they care. It's not going to be the solution, but we all have to do something. And then we need more sympathetic, or we need to have more informed writing in a way which is going to touch the emotions, not be sentimental, but to say what is really going on up in these communities. In Quebec, throughout the Quiet Revolution, it was led to a great extent by the intellectuals
By
and
the
the writers.
and the writers
In
and
the
the
United
fiction
States, among the
writers.
black community,
Yeah.
the same thing. We need to have real authors, not just an old Foreign Service officer picking up.
No, but I was at the book fair here on the first day when I came in, and I was struck by the fact that there was, don't laugh at me, that there was almost no book on constitutional issues anymore. It's gone. And but I walked and walked around, and I saw that there were many books on Native issues. But you're right, it's not fiction writing. It's not, and it's. I do believe that you've got something there, writing the stories from a more personal point of view, and the young people that you ask them to write their stories also. It cannot solve everything, but probably it can help a little bit, isn't it? And that's why you're doing it. So you told me that you were writing another novel.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Perhaps
And,
you might want to ask the question.
it's about time that we're getting to the end of this session because so we don't see people very much in the crowd with the slides. So if
Somebody right here, number 8.
you've got better eyes than I do. Yeah. So we'll start with the microphone with the left.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, Gail Bakey from the Labrador Inuit Territory from Nunatsiavut. I'm a PhD candidate and on faculty at Dalhousie University. I'm compelled, I don't usually want to speak in these forums, but I'm compelled to in many ways. One, I guess the main thought that comes to mind pertains to the overriding theme here of invisibility. The image that comes to my mind, or the metaphor has a very common one that many people will remember or recall, is the Emperor's New the Emperor's New Clothes story. And
Sorry, which story?
the Emperor's New Clothes.
Yes, yes.
That meant that.
Yes.
Might
Hans
not have all.
Christian Andersen.
Yeah, right. And of course, that story tells us, of course, that things are often visible, but there's something else. There's another phenomena happening here that takes what is obviously there, but turns it into something else, or there's a masking happening. So in my tenure or my time at the in the academy, I've come to see that there's a lot of attention paid to making things visible, say in research, where there's funds to investigate. We can investigate suicide. We can make that known. We can investigate violence. We can investigate health issues. We can make them visible. But where, and I think I'm compelled to sort of raise this in this intellectual forum, where are the opportunities to investigate why, for the reflexive investigation into why we still don't see? So sometimes I think we're asking the wrong question. Not what, that's not so much about, and we do still need to do that, investigate the fact that there are social issues and health issues and those kinds of things and make them visible. But there's time to and a need to investigate, why are we still complacent? Why are we still pretending that there's clothes when there isn't, and we know there isn't? And I don't see as much attention to that lens and resources for that.
I think, in a sense, though, you're talking about investigating why there is no attention to it, which is an academic approach. And I think, just as you pointed out, there's a lot of studies being done on it, but studies are cold. Studies are read by other academics and students who are writing papers. And so the reasons, can be all lined up. What we need to do is go from the studies to getting to the emotions, getting to the, what is the value, what is the power of a poem? You it's like music. It goes straight into your soul and it can change you. And so what I would suggest, if you're interested in this, and I see Leah Levesque up there who's interested, talking about people from the Trudeau Foundation, is to try your hand sometime at taking one of these academic studies and make it real. Make it the real story of an individual child or of a mother or a father or a grandfather and how they live their life. So that can be something which will appeal and make and resonate with the public as a whole to change attitudes.
And I totally agree with you. But I would have to say, in my experience in the academy, that while there are spaces to take those kinds of approaches, which is the approach I'm taking, it is not valued, it is not resourced, it is not supported to any great extent, and that is partly inhibiting because of the research institutions aren't as supportive of those kinds of approaches. That is, as you are suggesting, a barrier to understanding.
Yes,
and
I understand that, but I guess to some extent a writer has to suffer.
That's true. Yes.
Hello, my name is John Grant McLaughlin, and I teach in education at University of New Brunswick. And I was very touched, I'd even say shaken, by what you spoke because of a personal connection. And so I would just like to, we had a student from a family connection and a person from one of those communities you mentioned in Northern Ontario come and join us for high school. And I remember Fabian returning from his first day of high school in Toronto and saying, "Oh, it's so great here. They think I'm Filipino." Because he was so used to experiencing racism in Sioux Lookout and Thunder Bay. And he continued through high school and finished high school. And then in his mid-20s, sometime in the 1990s, we got a call saying he had taken his life.
Yeah.
And it's tragic. And I just thank you for sharing today. And I say this for Fabian too, and for the many
Thank you very
people.
much.
Okay, thank you.
My name's Graham Carr. I'm president of the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and I know there are other people who would like to have the opportunity to ask questions, so I'm pleased to say that Mr. Bartleman will be in the foyer signing books afterwards, and perhaps you can have an opportunity to continue the conversation with him then. In the meantime, though, on behalf of the Federation and certainly on behalf of everyone who is here this morning, I want to thank you very much for the presentation that you gave. I'm sure we will all take away different messages and different images, the images of invisibility, the images of communities in tears, the image of the racism of good people. You certainly brought another intensely personal and profound perspective to a series of conversations which we've been having in Fredericton this week about the place of First Nations peoples across Canadian society, and that's a conversation that will be ongoing in many society meetings for the rest of the week as well. Je voudrais en même temps remercier Madame Lise Bissonnette pour votre grâce et intelligence comme animatrice de cette conversation aujourd'hui. In closing, I would just say that you mentioned in the question and answer period the need for universities to become more actively involved as in a mentoring capacity for First Nations peoples, and you referred specifically to the summer school projects, which several Ontario universities are participating in. I think those of us coming from other universities will have an opportunity to reflect on that message and the possibility of taking it back to our campuses. In the meantime, though, I do want to point out that this afternoon in this very same room at 3:15, the equity issues portfolio of the Federation will be sponsoring a roundtable entitled Mentoring the Next Generation of Aboriginal Leaders. It takes place here at 3:15, and it's featuring Susan Aglukark, Maria Campbell, and Patricia Doyle-Bedwell as panelists, and I invite you all to return this afternoon. Please now join me in thanking both our guests, Mr. James Bartleman, Madame Lise Bissonnette, for what has been yet another very stimulating, big thinking breakfast.
Thank you.